Hello again. We're culminating today with Adam Coleman. I mean, this is double culmination here. This is, we are really going to seal the deal completely with the culmination concept. Adam is a guy who you have to, I'm going to let him tell the story himself, but he's one of these brave young African-American men who is not accepting what people tell him what to say, any people. And I a million times asked him to say giraffe, and I tried it. Guy will not do it. He's the founder of Wrong Speak Publishing, but I want to give him a chance to tell his story in his own words. So Adam, thanks for joining us, and I guess again for contributing to the twin culmination concept that we've got going today.
Yeah,
what's going on?
I appreciate you having me on. It's a pleasure and a blessing. Just to introduce myself a little bit, like I said, I'm the founder of Wrong Speak Publishing. I'm also a new author of a book called Black Victim to Black Victor.
Ah, right.
And it's a book of many things. It talks about issues that are happening within America for Black Americans, but it comes from a opposing narrative that is going around today that everybody tends to believe. But I focus a lot on family, the role of fathers, and how important they are. The gap between single parenthood and the nuclear family, and how it's a growing issue in general within America, and I find in other countries as well. So family is of the utmost importance, but I talk about a bunch of different things like morality, God to a degree. I try not to get over religious. It's not overly political, but I do talk about certain elements. Yeah.
That's the book obviously behind you.
Yes.
You can see it in your screens. You're well practiced at this, so you didn't jerk around to look at what's behind you. Now, tell me the Adam Coleman story. How do you get here?
I guess my story, just like anybody else's story of my childhood, I'm a child of a single parent home. My father was rarely in my life. Basically at one point I would hear from him maybe once or twice a year. If I was lucky, I'd see him once or twice a year. And when I did see him, it was like having a stranger come up. I didn't really have any type of connection with him. There was a period of time, actually, to rephrase that, when I was 16, that was the last time I saw him in person. The last time I talked to him, I was 21. I had my son, and I wanted to see if there was something there. And the last time I spoke to him was, like I said, like talking to a stranger, someone who's disinterested. So at that point, I pretty much told myself that I'm not going to try anymore. If he reaches out to me, I'll speak to him. I'd love to, but I'm not going to try anymore. You can't, you could bring a horse to the water, but you can't make him drink it, kind of thing. And that was the last time I spoke with him. I'm 37 years old today, and actually he passed away a few years ago. So, that is much of my story, the story of, the kid who's looking for his father to be in his life, and realizing how deficient I am as a man, or I was, I should say, as a man growing up, and how I struggled in my teens and 20s as well. And it wasn't until I would probably say a handful of years ago where I felt like I was figuring things out, and coming into my own. But it's one of those things where I look at people who have their father, who is a healthy father in their life, and they fill in those gaps. And I started examining how important that role is and what happens to people when they don't have that father figure in their life. So I talk about it a lot because it is the most glaring issue when it comes to Black Americans. It is the biggest problem. It's the number one stat that sticks out, the rate of single parent homes.
Do you agree with the widespread analysis or conclusion that the reason for this is because of the way public aid is structured? Or was there other factors going on as well?
That's one factor. It's hard for me to really get too far into that because, that was obviously before I was born. Everybody makes makes reference to, the 60s and the government coming in incentivizing single parent homes. That may be true. I think also that led to a change within the culture. And so a lot of what I talk about is a cultural thing. It's a cultural thing as far as what becomes acceptable. And for us, Black Americans are very tribalistic. There's no other way to put it. We see race as a very important thing, a very important signifier. And that's a good and bad thing. It's not all bad. But what I'm focusing on is how is that hindering us thinking in that particular way? And when that becomes our method of thinking, what happens when bad elements enter our culture? Are we willing to question our culture? And what I'm finding is that we're questioning it less and less. And the people who stand up and say, I think something is wrong, they get shouted down, or they be called, white sympathizers or coons or whatever you want to call it, when really they're just trying to ring the alarm that something is wrong here. So to kind of answer your question, I think that played a part. I think that started to change the culture, because when you see something starting to become normal, you don't question it. It's just normal at that point. And so when, I use the example of my fiance. She grew up in Brooklyn during the 80s. And she said the only family she remembers having both parents was a family that was from the Caribbean. Everybody else had one parent in their home. And this is nothing but Black people who lived there. And to her, she never really thought about it until she got older, how abnormal that is in the world. That is, it's a very abnormal thing, but to her, that was normal. Oh, your mom's there? No one really asked where dad is.
And as you pointed out, it's become much more normal, and not only far from being something that is unique to the African-American community.
Right.
It's a normal, you just used a word that often makes me jump when I hear it, my fiance.
Yeah.
People have these fiancés who were the mothers or fathers of children, 3 or 4 of their children, and they've been fiancés for 10, 15, 20 years. I got news for you. Sit down. It's going to make you sad. And this is, really a corruption, right, of what we mean. In my community,
mm-hmm.
Our dating is a relatively formalized process. There's a lot of pre-screening that goes on before a couple even meets, and engagements are almost never more than 2 or 3 months long, because once you've decided to go forward, you want to get on with business.
Right.
A couple of years ago, there was a lot of scholarship, a lot of public discussion about the topic of nuclear families.
Mm-hmm.
And we've now, instead of reacting to that by reinforcing nuclear families, we are now in this world where you can't eat. Forget Heather has 2 mommies. Neither one of them might be a mommy. Neither one of them might be a lady. This talk about a cultural problem, but I don't want to take us there necessarily, because I'm sure there's a lot of stuff in your book that, beyond this observation. I do know people who have had that experience that you've had, and some people never, it stays with them their whole life. It's a form of rejection.
Mm-hmm.
Your mother, it's extremely unusual for a mother to really reject a child. She's the one who gives birth. She's the one who has the baby. Of course, some parents give children up for adoption. It happens. But the father not being there, of course. So, on the other hand, right, you're saying that it became normal. If something's normal, we're saying that even if it becomes normal in the sense that that's what I see all around me, the child still feels something different.
Absolutely.
By the absence. Now, do you think it's true if it's any 2 parents, or that the child has a natural inclination based on just your observations and your, I'm not looking again to get into attacking anyone's way of life here, but when you look at gay adoption, which is a very, very popular phenomenon, and
mm-hmm.
and a lot of gay parents make excellent parents. But if a child has two mommies or two daddies, do you have any observations about whether that fills that hole, or anything to say about that? Here you can say whatever you want.
I think it can. I think that can help. You know, much of what I talk
Lots of love is good.
Yeah.
There's no real downside to it.
Absolutely. Much of what I talk about is it's a numbers game. You know, 2 is better than 1. That's one respect as to what I'm signifying, as in playing the role as the provider and the nurturer is a burdensome task for any person. You know, if the problem was single male parents, it'd be a similar type of problem. It'd be different problems that are happening, but it would be an issue because there's a deficiency in the nurturing department. Where we're seeing is a deficiency when it comes to the masculine traits or boundary setting, you know, things of that nature, the respect for authority. These are traditionally viewpoints and roles that are more traditional towards men. That's the best way of putting it. Men are more likely to assert a respect of boundaries. You know, rough and tumble play, for example, is one of those type of things where you're setting boundaries for children, and they learn.
That's a very, very interesting insight. In other words, rough and tumble play helps a child understand that the use of physical force isn't an absolute no. It's something that you have to learn to control. So it can actually be something that's fun for all involved.
Right.
Contact sports, you know, that helps a child feel secure, knowing that we're going to learn where those boundaries are.
Right, exactly. And that's the key word right there is boundaries. You know, for example, I see it like it translates into sexual boundaries, for example. When you start to learn boundaries just in general, it applies to all different types of areas, respect for other people's boundaries. So, for example, when you look at the high amounts of crime, or especially violent crime, that is committed by an extremely small percentage of people within the Black community, it's extremely disproportionate. But when you look at them, the vast majority of them come from single parent homes. And you have to ask, what kind of kid who respects people's boundaries, who respects other people's properties, who respects authority, commits crimes over and over and over, and ends up in jail? And the answer is, there is no kid that generally, you know, has those attributes that ends up in that predicament. So I'm looking at, how does the father play a role in that type of mindset and that type of behavior? Because no kid just wakes up one day and, you know, have a rosy sunshine childhood and starts to pull out a gun and start shooting at innocent people. It's a long process to make it to that point.
Right. There's an absolutely a missing gear.
Right.
The absolute lack of empathy for other people that we see in these little video snippets. People walking up to total strangers and beating them. Most of us wouldn't even be able to contemplate how to beat up someone who had it coming to him. You know, I mean, I suppose people. I mean, look, I once had to pound somebody in the face, and that's how I learned how to deal with bullies. And you know why I did that? Because my father made me.
Right.
My father taught me a lesson that he had to learn the same way when he was growing up in the Lower East Side. You know, that's an example, you know, of the kinds of things that fathers bring to the table.
Right.
Obviously, though, there's a leadership cadre in the Black community.
Yes.
That has decided that rather than truly seeking emancipation and independence, that victimization and the state are the path to something. Maybe it's just, you know, is it just something in the line of, I want to continue I want to be the leader and I've got the relationship with the government, or is there a good way to look at people who have made a career out of evidently maintaining and supporting policies that don't seem to help Black people. Let's talk about Barack Obama, for example.
Okay.
I mean, the greatest mystery of all the mysteries of Barack Obama is, why did he do so little focusing on the Black community when he was in office? What's your take on that?
I actually write about him in the book a little bit. My whole thing is that Barack Obama is the example of when you think that someone who looks like you is somehow your savior, right? Somehow your kin. There's a phrase that they throw around, not all skin folk are kinfolk, but they use it in a derogatory manner. What I'm actually saying is, just because they look like you doesn't mean that they're of the same class as you. And there's a difference. He went to Princeton, he went to Harvard, he's a lawyer. He's of a different class than the vast majority of Americans, not even just Black Americans. And when you look at him saying hope and change, and then he enters office, and what does he do? He lets his buddies in Wall Street of the same class, of the same elite status, get away with what they did, no prosecutions, and gave him a bailout and said, hey, try not to do it again. And then we know what happens with Congress behind the scenes passing laws to prevent that type of collapse happening again, where they just keep throwing money at it and hopefully it doesn't fall apart without bringing warning to the American public. So, or actually without having to go back to Congress like how they did before. So what you're seeing there is someone of a different class, of a different mindset, of an elite status. And even he started peddling race as a distraction, so nobody would focus on what he was doing.
The crystallizing moment for me in that phenomenon was I was in a dry cleaner in Passaic, New Jersey, picking up my stuff. And everyone who worked there was what we now call people of color. They weren't all Black, mostly Hispanic. And just at that, and the radio was on, just at that moment while I was picking this stuff up, the O.J. Simpson verdict came in. And they all started cheering. And I remember thinking, why are these people cheering for O.J.? What did O.J. ever do for them?
Yeah.
He was the most assimilated Black man in America.
Yeah.
Until he was arrested, and he turned it into a racial thing. And it was mind-boggling to me, mind-boggling. And yet that switch successfully worked.
Yeah, and actually it's worked for decades. You had brought up Black leadership, and I take issue that we're the only demographic who's expected to have leadership of our race. And that's a problem, because once someone's arbitrarily a leader, like we didn't vote for anybody. We didn't vote for Al Sharpton to be, the racial leader, but he put himself there. And even more so, the political establishment ensures that he's there. The media establishment assures that he's there. As soon as something happens, they give him the cameras and make him the focal point. There's a reason why the victims of these police shootings are starting to look back at the quote unquote activists and saying, why are you using our dead loved ones' names to profit off of? And that is because they're finally saying something about it. They're finally sticking up and saying, why are these people getting rich off of my dead relative's name and we're not getting a penny for it? Or why is anybody making any money off of this? What is this actually helping? And it's helping to enrich people, for arbitrary reasons. There is no Al Sharpton Center the last time I checked. And I've looked personally at his nonprofit's taxes, and he pays himself over $1 million a year. He doesn't really have a staff, and he has arbitrary.
And he doesn't really have a job.
Right. He doesn't really have a job either. Yet somehow he's able to bring in over $1 million a year to pay himself. So I asked myself, what is he actually doing? What's his benefit if he's a so-called Black leader? So I look at all those things, and there's a chapter I call, the Ivory Tower Black Elites is the name of the chapter, because there are so many people who, all right, let me put it this way. One thing I've noticed is that the people who say that Black people are incapable of doing something because of systemic racism are the most privileged Black people that have ever existed in mankind. They're the most wealthy. Even someone like Oprah is now peddling white supremacy as the preventer from all Black people doing certain things. The nerve of her to come from poverty to become a billionaire off the backs of white women loving her to death, to now turn around and look at the people that propped her up and gave her all that money to say, you're my oppressor. It's that type of, we throw that around.
But what she does to her fellow Blacks is much worse than what she does to the white people, because the white people couldn't, who cares what Oprah says, but what she is doing is manipulating, that Black power structure that says skin is kin. Yeah. The OJ phenomenon and the Obama phenomenon said, yeah, she's right, she's onto something, and there's this lack of awareness that look, these people haven't done jack for you. They're not, right. they're not fighting for you. They're not living your life in any meaningful way, and they're just playing off identity politics to make themselves feel better and also to progress in their careers.
Absolutely. And another big example is LeBron James. LeBron James was one of the most critical people of the police. Yet who do you think walks him into all these stadiums across the country? The police. He finds such ease by even insinuating that a cop may have a bad day and wake up on the wrong side of the bed, and he might kill a Black person just cause. Meanwhile, he leaves the press conference walking alongside police who are escorting him to his vehicle. It's that cognitive dissonance that I'm talking about. Either he really believes that, or he's manipulating people to believe that to gain some sort of social currency. Either way, it's not good.
That's not good, and it's also not good that the police do it. Yeah. And they might have their job, but they also have their unions, and the unions are completely bought into this stuff because it benefits them as well. Yeah. Even though historically, unions have not only done little for Blacks, they've been a gigantic obstacle to Black advancement. Mm-hmm. by having basically a closed system that often favored connections in terms of getting into a closed shops and all the reasons. So now let's look at the counter at the flip side of that case. Mm-hmm. Larry Elder, mm-hmm. the face of Black, the tanned face of white supremacism. Yeah. They'll just say anything, won't they? Yes. Anything. Yeah. Have any prominent Blacks in American political life, other than the people we would expect on Twitter, Candace Owens, but have any of the professional public people said a thing about either the attack on him, and this is an actual question, or the way the media underplayed the attack on him? Are you aware of any?
It's from the usual suspects. Part of the problem is, and it's something that I became glaringly aware of, is that the mainstream media is overly biased when it comes to race. They only like one particular narrative, and they shut out another narrative. They're not trying to be factual, or they reframe things if they are talking about something. So the Larry Elder situation, if Larry Elder had a D next to his name, we would not stop talking about how a Republican wearing a gorilla mask threw something at a Democrat, candidate running for governor in California, the first Black governor position that would have ever happened. So we would say this has something to do with race. And you know what? This woman throwing at Larry Elder may actually have zero to do about race, right? For all I know, she just doesn't like his politics because he's running as a Republican. But it's always given the assumption that it's race when it's the other side. And so I question, why is that the case? Why is it perfectly okay for someone to publicly, and I actually talk about this in the book, where it's called the misunderstanding of Black Republicans and Black conservatives, where people can go on television and call someone an Uncle Tom and a coon, and they never lose their job. At most, they might get a little criticism like, wow, I can't believe they say that. And I list a bunch of different examples, and nothing ever happens to these people. You can say whatever you want derogatory towards a Black person as long as they're conservative or they're a Republican or both. And it's that kind of situation that we see when it comes to Larry Elder.
Now, and what you're describing now, I remember from the summer of 2020, all these suburban white chicks coming in for a night of fun rioting, screaming and yelling at Black cops, every racial slur in the book. And what I'm wondering is, does that kind of footage and the Larry Elder stuff, is it happening? Do you think people other than that activist edge in the media and in the institutions that are controlling the levers of power, but do you think people are beginning to catch on?
To some degree. I think with the pandemic situation, everybody forced to stay home, everything shut down, there's no entertainment, everybody became hyper political. And even for myself, I've had a change. I'm a former Democrat, I'm a former liberal. And I've had a change for a variety of reasons, not necessarily because of the pandemic, but actually the pandemic highlighted things that I was aware of, but it just made it glaringly obvious. I like to say all the time that the stuff that they, used to whisper, they say out loud now. And it's become very, very obvious that there is a bias that is happening. They're not even trying to hide it anymore. So I think ultimately, people are aware that stuff like this is happening. People are very, very focused on politics. I've met so many different people of different backgrounds, ethnicities, where they were former Democrats and they left for a variety of reasons, and their eyes have been opened. They like to say they took the red pill, and they see how the media is lying about a bunch of different things. I'm aware of how the media frames certain stories. And you read the story, the title is misleading, then you read the story, like that's not matching what the title says, because they know that people are just going to read the title and never read the story, and that they can keep pushing a particular narrative.
When was that red pill moment for you?
It wasn't, I wouldn't say it was one particular moment, but there were several. I detail in the book, I did some traveling. I started traveling around Europe a few years ago, and coincidentally, I ended up in Madrid, and I was in a pub watching soccer games. I'm really into soccer. And funny enough, maybe this is like a religious moment for me, but my team had finished playing and I was about to leave, and it's been a sunny day all day. All of a sudden, torrential downpour. I had nothing. So I was forced to stay there. I was like, oh, there's more games on, let me watch. And so there was a Manchester City game that was on, and I sat next to a guy and we just started talking. And we're just talking about comedy and stuff like that. He was actually British, but he was living in Spain. So we kept in contact and we had good faith in conversation. But when Brexit was happening, he said he was for Brexit. So I asked him, why is that the case? And he said, the United States would never allow for an outside governing body to tell it what to do. And I was like, that's a really good point. And my mentality before was, well, the media was saying Brexit was all about these white supremacists in England who want foreigners out of their country. And I never heard that perspective. And that makes so much sense. And he actually introduced me to Thomas Sowell. So a British conservative introduced me, a Black American, to Thomas Sowell, and I had never heard of Thomas Sowell. And I had been into politics too. And how is that the case? How have I never heard of this guy? So that was a major moment for me.
That's interesting, because my wife often talks about how Thomas Sowell was the first person she was exposed to who, in a long form and deep and nuanced and academic fashion, argued, explained these conservative points of view that she'd never been exposed to when she was in
Yeah.
college. How long ago is this though? This experience that you just described?
I want to say it was 2019.
Okay, just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it's very new experience. Maybe it's 2018. I might be confusing. With the pandemic, everything seems so blurred.
Yes, it is hard. It's true. So this is interesting to me. So you're really kind of new to the conservative scene. How are the Nazis treating you?
They're some of the nicest Nazis you'd ever meet.
Yes, I've met most of them.
Yeah. No, actually, that was one of those things where I started realizing when you enter anything, a conversation, an arena with a certain perspective, let me say a certain assumption. That's the best word. When you enter an arena with a certain assumption about someone, then immediately you're going to pick apart what they're saying to you. But if you go in with a blank state and someone's just talking to you, then you're like, okay, I'm taking what you're saying for value. And I think before I would have said, yeah, but maybe they're a little bit racist or something, like things would have been revolving around race. But once I started losing that frame of thinking and just started listening to people, some of the most religious, God-fearing, just generally good-hearted people who really, really care. And even more so than some of my liberal friends that I had lost along the way. Not too many, but actually, I would say they were edging on leftist friends. But those people dropped me as soon as I even made a particular question. I wasn't even fully over. I was questioning things. And so to me, it was worth losing those people to gain the amazing people that I met along the way.
Well, also you found out that what you lost was not nearly what you thought you had.
Exactly.
I mean, it's an amazing thing. I haven't written off anyone who among my many friends and family members because of their political views. I think they're really deceiving themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike what a lot of people think, I don't think they're stupid. I think many of them are quite intelligent,
Right.
but that they're deeply committed to an approach of cognitive dissonance to their way of dealing with the world. But it's not the other way around. The people have no compunction about writing me off or responding to things that I might post, on Facebook with the nastiest personal comments. Who gave you permission to do that? Why? We just disagree about a political issue. I mean, all of a sudden people have obviously been conditioned to think like this. So let's talk about, we can't solve all the problems, not during this podcast and probably not even before Monday. Yeah. So your book focuses on the particular way all this is affecting Blacks in America. What is the solution that you suggest, or what is there a program? Obviously, more than one thing has to happen. What do you think is the number one thing you could choose? One change that we could make, or one effort we could all get behind? What would that be?
So just before I answer that, just to make a clarification, even though the book is talking about Black Americans, it is almost like a case study, right? So they're the case study in this situation, but there are so many different concepts and principles I'm talking about. It's a book for everybody. So I've had people in different countries, different ethnicities. I found something within it. So I just wanted to clarify for the audience.
Oh, sure. Everyone should go out and buy it. Buy 4.
Yeah, I appreciate that. But to answer your question, the number one thing is finding commonality. I think that has to be the most essential thing, regardless if it's a difference of skin color, religion, political ideology. You have to find some sort of commonality with people, because regardless if we like it or not, we live in a multicultural society. We don't live in a homogenous nation. It is very diverse here. And so we have diversity of ethnicity, cultural viewpoints, religion. We have a complete diversity. You should see the building I live in. It's the United Nations in here, and that's great. but we all have to find a way to get along with each other. Otherwise, this experiment that we're doing in America is not going to work. But I truly believe it will, and it has been. But what's happening is there are certain people who are hijacking a narrative, who are placing enemies out of people that weren't their enemy. They're making something out of nothing. And we have to get back to that point where if we talk about race is not that important. It really isn't. There's nothing special about my skin color in particular than your skin color. It's just pigmentation. What matters more is my character. What matters more is my attitude, my faith, how I am as a father, how I'm soon to be as a husband. Those things matter. And my skin color is something that's arbitrary, just like my eye color is arbitrary. It's just pigmentation. So we have to get back to finding something, and also there's a chapter where I'm talking about this specifically. I give 9 solutions within the chapter because I didn't want to complain and not have some sort of solutions. But in that chapter, I talk about a man that I met during my transition in thinking and meeting people, meeting conservatives and having conservative viewpoints. And he's in his 70s, he's white, lives in the Midwest, completely different types of backgrounds. But what we shared in common is that we both didn't have our fathers in our life. And we bonded over that. And we talked all the time about that and how it affected him, at, with drinking and becoming, a father and messing up and working together, trying to encourage him to rekindle a relationship with his children. Because in many ways, I wanted that, even though my father wasn't there when I was a child. If my father came to me in my 20s and said, "I'm sorry, let's try," I would have been all for it. And he's been able to do that. And without that ability to look past the superficial, I don't know where he'd be and I don't know where I'd be, because he was influential for me as well.
So to you, that's really, that's the starting point. And, one of the things you said at the very beginning of our talk that makes that sound right to me is one of the big problems, to my point of view, is the feminization of American discourse. Not just necessarily the American man. There are lots of guys out there who work out, who can crush a beer can, on their forehead, and who are, more manly than I am in that respect,
Right.
perhaps, but who are not men at all. They simply don't have those masculine virtues. And my wife, Jane Coleman, the respected legal writer and essayist, is constantly decrying the feminization of American culture.
Yeah.
And the elevation of emotional responses to every problem over practical responses, and feelings over facts. And if, it's not enough just to park the guy who inseminated the woman in the house. He's got a problem, right? Because if he, even if we were able to fix everything starting from zero now,
Mm-hmm.
he still was not raised by a dad. He doesn't, but I will tell you something. I've known some really incredible dads who didn't have dads themselves. They can do it. You did say something that kind of made me wonder. You were talking about the arbitrariness of skin pigmentation.
Yeah.
It is kind of arbitrary. We know, for example, that at least when I was still in school and I was studying anthropology as an elective course, race in human, there's no such thing as race
Right.
in the human species. All humans can breed with each other, and the qualities, the characteristics that define supposedly a race are often found at the end of every scale in every other race. You can see it. You can see white people who you could swear they were black. You can see black people who you never would have dreamt were black. Putting that aside,
Mm-hmm.
there are still cultural differences within, you're writing a book about black victims, there's such a thing as black people in America.
Right.
Now, as you pointed out, some of them are Barack Obama and Eric Holder, and some of them are Jay-Z, and some of them are that guy in the street who coldly shoots 6 people because he was disrespected at a party 2 hours earlier.
Right.
And those people have very little in common culturally. But is that enough? Is it enough to say, in other words, who are we talking about in Black? Who's the Black victim and who's the Black victor? Which Black America are these guys part of?
In many ways, they're both part of the same culture, even though they're in different classes. So the victim part is more of a mentality of what I'm talking about. You could be a legitimate victim of some sort of crime, for example, but many people who are victims say, "Don't call me a victim," and what they're referencing is, you're trying to label me and you're trying to put me in a particular mindset. I'm not that. I'm someone who overcame. I'm a survivor. They like to use that word instead because they overcame that situation. I'm also using that in the way of saying you're a victor. You overcame these particular things.
Sure.
So, when we talk about Black American history, I have a problem with it because of how we talk about Black American history. We always talk about it from, slavery, what was done to Black people, Jim Crow, what was done to Black people, but we never say, look, we were able to overcome despite the negatives that had happened. Why don't we ever talk about it in that particular way? And by referencing everything from a victim standpoint, we are always referencing the past as a trauma experience. And what I talk about is how Black Americans, many of us, grow up in an environment where we are taught to relate to the trauma of the past and always feel that trauma. So when something happens, it is relatable to the trauma that we never experienced personally, but someone else's trauma who happens to look like me. It's a very harmful way to move about life.
You're right. And I'll tell you something you might not have never thought of.
Mm-hmm.
I think the worst thing for American Jews is this obsession with Holocaust education.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not talking about denying, God forbid. I'm not talking about anything, any lack of truth. But this idea that people say, well, the reason there's anti-Semitism is there's not enough Holocaust education. Would you want to consider the possibility that the reason there's anti-Semitism, I'm talking about the casual anti-Semitism of bored, stupid, obnoxious kids,
right,
is because they're tired of hearing about the Holocaust, and that you have succeeded in framing Jews as great victims.
Mm-hmm.
These Jews are excellent at being victims. Look at them. They don't hit back like the Black people. They just, they might meekly go to their deaths. The reason I raise this is because that victim mentality doesn't only affect the victim class, it affects the way others perceive the victim class. And to some extent, the white person of the best possible faith who sincerely wants to buy into this because they want to be empathetic, they want to be a good person and a good guy and feel good about voting for Barack Obama because he's a Black guy they can feel comfortable voting for, right?
Yeah.
They're buying into this. And that's great as long as there's an Obama around who at least can, but I say it's great. It's great for Obama. It's great for Michelle. It's not great for Adam. Didn't do a damn thing for you. Nothing. In fact, It actually set you back because when those are the real Uncle Toms, right? Those are the real coons. Because the guys like that do nothing for you. They live in the big house, but they don't do a damn thing for the community as a whole. I mean, Donald Trump did more in this first year for the Black community than Obama did in 8 years. I mean, that's just a fact. Adam, I'm running out of words, but you look like you haven't.
Well, I was going to say, I referenced that as the liberal savior complex.
Sure.
It's just to give a quick story. I became
Take
a friend.
It's in slow motion. We're not going anywhere.
All right.
I just don't like to overburden my guests.
No, it's no burden. There's a guy that I met while traveling, and he's from the Netherlands, and we had met up actually a few times, and we were building a pretty good friendship. And he admitted like he has trouble keeping in contact with people, but we were able to do it until he found out that I had no problem with Donald Trump. And then from that moment on, it wasn't necessarily a disagreement in politics, because I was like, screw politics. We don't even have to talk it. You don't even live in this country. Like, it doesn't matter. Let's talk about something else. But he felt the need to try to save me. As a matter of fact, the last text message he sent me, he's like, this is my last attempt to save you. And it's that type of mentality.
Audacity.
Right. It's, to me, it was like, how dare you, as someone who is, if we want to talk about race, you're white, you live in a different country, you're not in my skin, living in America, you've barely visited America, you've never even lived here, right? So you have all different types of audacities to tell me, who's lived in multiple states. I've lived in 5 states in my life. I've lived around white people majority of my life. And how are you going to tell me what my experience is? And how can you not see how racist America is? I've lived here my entire life. How are you telling me as a foreigner what America is? But he was so glued into the greater narrative as a foreigner, not, I say foreigner, but as someone who doesn't live within this country, to dictate to me as someone who does, simply because I'm Black. And he wants to project that I am a victim. You can't see that you're a victim. I'm pretty good. I'm fine. No. You're a victim. That's essentially what he's trying to tell me.
But that's right out of Marx.
Yeah.
That's consciousness raising. The proletariat doesn't know the situation. They don't know how bad they have it. And my wife likes to. You're getting a lot of Jane Coleman references in this one today. My wife, who is the better educated and smarter person in the house, likes to point out to me that there's a really, really good essay by I think it was Art Buchwald, which is way before your time. He probably died before you were born, but he was one of the great New York Times columnists back in the day. And he talks about how the early feminists in the 50s and 60s were trying to explain to women how bad off they had it.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't understand. Their husbands loved them and they were comfortable and they were living a much easier and happier life than their mothers did. And they could go to college if they wanted to. And these women were telling them, no, you're slaves. You're second-class citizens. You're the nigger of the world, as John Lennon said.
Mm.
And he was not a conservative. In those days, things weren't as liberal conservative as they are now. Even before COVID, they were much more. And it's a fantastic essay that's been really. Maybe I'll dig it up and I'll tweet it after this we drop this. But this, I think we've got to start with everybody reading Black Victim to Black Victor, Black Victim to Black Victor. Who is this Victor though? That's the one thing I didn't understand.
The victor in many ways is myself. One thing about the book, there's a lot of stories. So it's not just, technical jargon and philosophy. It's a lot of stories. And I'm using my personal story, almost kind of like an anecdote, but I'm using my story to talk about the effects of certain things. So when I talk about the effects of not having your father, I'm talking very intimately about what it felt like for me as a child, not having my father around. What was our relationship like? Along with giving, some behavioral analysis and things like that. But I give a lot of stories throughout the book because it's very personable to read it that way. So it's much more interesting than, trying to hypothesize all different types of things by that. So much of the book is like my life story.
How long did it take you to write the book?
I would say start to finish about 9 months or so.
And this was part-time? You've got a regular day job like the rest of us?
Yeah, I have a regular day job. I wrote it. I probably spent hour to an hour and a half every day, either writing or editing,
cool.
Or during the week.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was first time, my first book, first attempt.
Good for you.
Yeah.
Best of luck with it.
Thank
Adam,
you.
great talking to you. Have a nice weekend. And thank you for the opportunity, and great to get to know you a little bit better.
Thank you. I appreciate it.